Okay, hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the seminar of mathematical psychology and its application in second season. This day, we are very honored to have the participation of Dr. Rachel Wu from the University of California at Riverside. And before introducing our guest today, you know that I will always like to give some words to my students and all the supports that I have received from them. So I want to thank all of you for all the support that we have from you to all these activities. And during these 5 years, we have worked intensely to bring you different activities, which the objective of these activities is to contribute to your education as psychological professionals. So we sincerely hope that we can continue to carry out this noble work for all of you. And to all my students of the Neuro-COGNiMATH LAB group, we from the past and now the present, all my appreciation and admiration. Now we always be proud of you, and the reaching where we have arrived will not be possible without you. So to my college also and the department chair, thank you very much for your support. And today's topics is fascinating. I will always found it relevant and exciting to do research on learning, and now in particular towards the older adulthood. And Rachel's work in this line of research is extraordinary. It's an honor for me to have her here today, and I thank her infinitely for the opportunity she gave us to share her knowledge and experience. My complete admiration for her career, and I'm deeply thankful for her kindness and support. So, without any further ado, allow me to introduce our guest with a brief summary of her career. I want to read a little bit about her research. She's a development cognitive neuroscientist investigating, attending to, and learning relevant information across the lifespan. Her EEG and behavioral research from infancy to aging adulthood investigate how learning factors as prior knowledge, learning approach, and environmental factors as could be learning from people facilitate the selection of relevant information to promote new learning in some contexts, while beginning detrimental new learning in other contexts. Cross-pollinating child development and aging research has the potential to promote cognitive growth across the lifespan. She is an assistant professor of the University of California in Riverside. She did a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Rochester and also a postdoctoral position at Birkbeck in London. She obtained her PhD in psychology at the Center of Brain and Cognitive Development at Birkbeck, University of London. She had a diploma in art and design. She has a master's degree in psychoanalytic developmental psychology from the Anna Freud Center at the University College London, and her BS in psychology and BS in history and anthropology from the Carnegie Mellon University. She had a lot of grants, a lot of paper. She is very amazing. So thank you very much, Rachel, for this great opportunity. The stage is all yours. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Alfonso, for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. So I want to tell you a little bit about my research that I've been doing for the last maybe 10 years or so. And it focuses on how we learn what to learn across the lifespan. And so I'll just start sharing now here. So the issue of learning what to learn is really most obvious for infants and children. And, you know, if you have any children, this might be what your house looks like. You have a playroom for your kids or something like that. And so you, as an infant, you know, or a child, as you're going into a room like this, there are a lot of things to look at and learn about. And how do you know what is really the most relevant to learn about at any given time? But this issue, you know, doesn't really go away when you're older. I mean, when you're older, you do, you know a little bit more about the world. But when you're, let's say, a graduate student and you're trying to learn, you know, everything about a particular research area, you might have a stack of articles and then you don't entirely know what's the most relevant. And so you might rely on your advisor to tell you, you know, what's most relevant to read at any given time. And also now with fake news and, you know, and issues like that appearing, it's even more relevant now to figure out what is relevant in the world. So there are 4 ways that I've thought about in terms of how you can figure out what's relevant, what you're supposed to be learning about. And one of those ways is by just stimulus characteristics. So the way things are kind of appearing in the world. you can, maybe rely on the things that are most frequent or the most salient, the most obvious, or, patterns in the world. And so a lot of this work could be, investigated with statistical learning techniques. So, looking at any patterns that, come up in the world. And so infants rely on this a lot. Infants and children rely on this a lot because they don't have a lot of other ways, of figuring out what's relevant in the world. So they also, you can also have reinforcement tell you, so what you're paid for, what you're praised for, and things like that. And also people can tell you, they can just say, advisors can say, this is relevant, you got to learn this or something. And so infants and kids also rely heavily on people, their caregivers, their teachers, and things like that. And prior knowledge is the last one. So what has been relevant in the past could potentially still be relevant. However, if you change to a new environment or something, and your prior knowledge is no longer relevant, you need to adapt and not rely only on prior knowledge. So if you're only relying on each of these 4 things, there are problems for each of those. If you're only relying on stimulus characteristics, for example, to figure out what's relevant, you whoops. Oh no, I think I deleted it. You might have multiple patterns that come up, or you could have things that are very subtle that come up that you might miss if you're only relying on stimulus characteristics. If you rely only on reinforcement, what if there's no reinforcement, or what if it's delayed? Then you might have issues in terms of learning, in terms of timing. If you have people that you're relying on, but if the people are unreliable or they're unavailable, then you're also going to have issues as well. And then if your prior knowledge is no longer relevant or not available, then you might have issues as well. So I've looked at how all of these things, all of these ways of learning what to learn can be utilized across the lifespan. And so I'll just start first by telling you about stimulus characteristics. So some of the, so that's where it popped up. Okay. So some of the work I've done with infants has looked at when there are multiple or subtle patterns to look at and learn about in the world, then how do infants, deal with that? So, so one thing that you one thing you have to learn as infants is to figure out what are actually objects. Right. So if you see an object, if you see an image like this with a dog and a hamburger on his head, how do you know that it's a dog with a hamburger on his head? As an adult, we say that it's a dog with a hamburger, but as an infant, you don't have enough prior knowledge to know that burgers are separate from dogs, right? But over time, what you can do is observe different instances of the same dog, for example, with stuff on his head, and you'll notice that some things will always be there and some things may be different. So the burger is not always there, but the head and the body are always there. Sometimes the color is different. And so from these types of cues, from this type of information, you can get a general sense of what is part of the object and what is not. And so it's this type of phenomenon that affects infants when, for example, let's say you have a new baby, and the baby is 9 months old, and for 9 months you haven't shaved your beard, and then you suddenly shave your beard, the infants will be really kind of scared because they don't know that the beard can be something that can come off. So it's almost as if like your head came off or your arm came off or something like that. So we did this study to kind of test this idea out. So the yellow and the pink shapes were always there. And so the yellow is kind of like the dog's head and the pink is kind of like the dog's body. And then the blue is kind of like the pizza on the head or the hamburger on the head. And so you can see how these things might change. And then there's some things that will always be consistent. And so with infant studies, the interesting thing is if you show an infant something that is very surprising to them, they will look longer at it. So in this case, if you see the blue shape splitting apart from the yellow and the pink, not that surprising. But if you see the yellow thing coming off, it's kind of like the head coming off of the body. And so this is what we tested. So whether it's consistent with their expectations or inconsistent, depending on where the split is happening in the objects. And so So we brought in infants and, made them watch these little objects on the screen, and then, had them split. And over time, anything above the 0 line here is a preference for the thing that was splitting in a way that was inconsistent with their expectations. So this is kind of like the dog's head coming apart from the body. And so they preferred to look at that longer than if the dog's head stayed with the body. So now, but what if you have multiple multiple, relevant objects to be learning about, right? What do you do if you have, let's say, even just 2 items? This is less than a playroom, right? Which has, many items. But here you have 2 things that you could be learning about. And if you try to learn about both, you're not going to do very well. So how can you figure out what to learn? Well, if you have somebody there telling them, look over here, look at this one over here, then they might actually do better than if they didn't have somebody there, right? So they end up learning more about this object rather than another object that's equally interesting on the other side. So this is what I showed you before when it's just one thing on the screen. So kind of like this one thing here on the screen. Now, if you have 2 things on the screen and a person, how well do? They do pretty much just as well. If you have somebody telling them looking there, it's almost like this thing doesn't even exist, which is kind of cool. But it does exist, and in the real world, the real world is very noisy. So it speaks to how much power the person has in terms of getting the infant to look in a particular location and then getting them to learn about that object. And this all happens around 8 to 9 months of age. So, but then what happens when people are unreliable, right? So like if you can rely on people, great. But then sometimes, people are not reliable. And in the natural environment, even, really good caregivers are about something like, 70 or 80% reliable in terms of how often they respond to you, how quickly they respond to you, how accurately they respond to you, and things like that. So, so given that the world contains unreliable people to learn from, this picture kind of captures, the kind of dynamic in the real world. So the world is very ordered in many ways. Like there are a lot of patterns you can learn from, and objects you can learn about, and the people can direct you to that, right? But if you're an infant who has learned to learn from a particular person, it turns out that you can learn from other people of a similar race, even if they're not that reliable, because you've been learning from a slightly unreliable person, for 8-9 months. And so let's say this is a Caucasian baby raised by a Caucasian mother. The baby doesn't actually really matter what race the baby is themselves. It's more the race that the person is that they're learning from. So they will be able to learn from Caucasian faces better, even if the Caucasian faces are a little unreliable. So if you're, let's say, a Black baby and you were raised by Black parents, then you're going to be learning from Black people, even if they're unreliable. But if you're told to learn from a Caucasian face, you're not going to be able to learn from Caucasian faces as well if they're unreliable. But you can learn from them if they're 100% accurate. So, we did the study in China. And we tested infants who were exposed to Chinese faces pretty much 100% of the time. And they learned very well from Chinese faces, even if the Chinese faces were not that reliable. But then with a Black face saying, the same kind of speech and things like that, they would only learn from them well if the Black faces were 100% reliable. So let's say if you're learning from, a Latina mother 100% of the time, you might not you might not be able to learn from Caucasian faces if they're slightly unreliable. And so this matters a lot because you might have teachers or other caregivers or nannies or whatever, and the infant has to learn from different faces, throughout their life. Or if they do, then they would require training to be able to do that. So it's an interesting finding for that study. So then we also have studies looking at, well, okay, what about prior knowledge? So as an adult, you're able to, go around the world having a general sense of, what objects are. You don't often go around, thinking, what am I going to do next or something. You might, if you have some life crisis kind of issues, but you might, so you have a general sense of how to interact with the world. More so than infants and babies, infants and children. So, so we want to study with young adults. How, now that you have a general idea of what might be relevant, how can you figure out what is relevant? And when you have knowledge about what is relevant, how might that interfere with some cognitive processes if your knowledge actually interferes with the task at hand, if the knowledge that you have does not match the task that you're supposed to be doing. So one way of investigating this is by looking at categorization. So how we can categorize things and then search for things. So so here, we use the example of I don't know what your grocery stores look like in Mexico, but this is what they look like in the U.S. And so when you go in and you search for, your cereal, your bread, you just pick up the groceries you need for, let's say the week. And that's totally fine and very doable for a young adult. But if you send an infant into the grocery store to pick up the groceries for a week, they won't be able to do it, partially because they don't have the knowledge of, the objects that we know as adults. So one example of how this might be conceptualized in adulthood. So if I say, go get me some dragon fruit, and as an adult, you might be like, I don't know what dragon fruit is. You can have people teach you what it is. I could say it's it's a type of fruit and it has like a pink, skin. So then you might, think that, oh yeah, that's dragon fruit, right? So like there's not knowing what to look for or search for and categorize is actually a problem from earlier on, but also could be something like, let's say if you move to a new country or are in a new environment in some way. So we study this by looking at EEG and behavioral responses. So EEG allows us to understand better the timing of the cognitive processes, because behavior happens around 600, 500 milliseconds at the soonest usually. And so there's a lot of time between, when something comes up on a computer screen and when, how long it takes your brain to process all that information to then lead to a behavioral response. So with EEG, then you can get information from the 0 to 500 mark and beyond too. And it also can tell us about things that might be present in the brain, but not so much in behavioral responses. And also vice versa. So sometimes it's present in behavioral responses, but not in the brain. And it also provides an implicit measure of target selection. So it doesn't require you to say, yes, it's there or something like that. Like your brain will provide responses regardless of whether you explicitly say that something is there or not. And the component that we look at is the N2PC event-related potential. And it's really very convenient because it is a marker for, I found what I'm looking for. So it's very convenient for investigating when people have selected a target, an object. And so this is the component that I was just talking about, the N2PC. So what is it? So on the x-axis, you have time, and on the y-axis, you have microvolts. So this is the amplitude of the signal. So these brain signals are collected from the scalp. And so the N2PC is basically this envelope that opens up from around 200 to 400 milliseconds. It usually starts around 200 milliseconds. And so what is this envelope? So if I so look over here. So this is the nose of somebody, and this is the kind of cap that they're wearing. So this is the back of the head here. So if I tell the person to look for a letter F, and the letter F shows up on the left side, then this electrode here is more negative than this electrode here. And then if I move F to over here, then this area is more negative than this for this electrode. So the opposite electrode that is measuring these brain responses is always more negative than the one on the same side as the stimulus. So that's why the contralateral side is more negative than the ipsilateral side, which is more positive. And so this envelope that opens up around 200 milliseconds indicates that you found what you're looking for. And the nice thing is when you subtract those two waveforms, you can see it much more easily. It's this big dip that happens in the same time window. So how do we know it's what we're looking for? Well, there are studies that show that, it comes up only on the opposite side of the target. And there has to be something there. Like, it can't just be empty space. Maybe something was there before, but, there has to have been something there previously, or currently is something there now. And it's also mostly top down rather than bottom up. So if it's something that you want to look for, that's usually when you have the components. If it's something you don't want, like you don't need to look for, but then just shows up randomly, maybe is very bright or something, it might come up a little bit, but not as much as something you really want to look for. And the other interesting thing we found was that if you have one thing to look for, you're very good. The component is very robust. If you look for two things at the same time, it's less robust, and then three things, it's really hard to do, first of all, and also your component is attenuated. So this tells you that there's some limitation to the visual search system, right? So you can really look for one thing really, really well. Two things, not so much. Three things, really hard. Four things, like, forget it. People won't even want to do the study. So so we did this study where, we asked them to look for one letter or two letters or three letters. How well do they do, right? And that was the data that, I just showed you. However, if this is the limitation, we don't go around the world being limited by visual search abilities. Like, we're very good at visual search in the real world. So how do we do that? One way, I think, is by categorizing things, so grouping things together into one unit. So if we say search for any letter, it's actually quite similar to searching for just even one letter. You have to have the distractors be not letters, though, to be able to do a task like this. But if I say look for one letter, like the letter A, or two or three, or any letter, as long as the distractors are not letters like numbers, for example, then you're going to be actually almost like just searching for one thing. So it's a very pronounced effect to be able to categorize, let's say 26 letters and search for that as one thing. But it doesn't, so that's the benefit, right? But it doesn't come with, no cost. There are still costs that will come with that. And one cost is that if I tell you to look for the letter A and the letter R shows up, then what happens is you have this component here that is in the N2PC time window, and it's like your brain is selecting that target and then saying, oh, but that's not the one I'm looking for. So, oh, that's a letter, but that's not the letter I'm looking for, because you've grouped things so tightly that it's hard to individuate the objects. So, for young adults, they can recover from this, and it's not, that big of a deal. And so we're interested in seeing, how these effects emerge, as you're learning new things, and as you gain a lot of prior knowledge, how might, this kind of effect compound over time. And so over a lot of studies, we've looked at, beyond letters and numbers, we've looked at kitchen items and clothing and healthy food versus unhealthy food, human faces, ape faces, and things like that. And we've been able to replicate these findings. And we've also shown that, you can train people up in novel categories. So if you're English speaking, you don't know about Chinese characters, and we tell you to look for numbers versus non-numbers in Chinese characters, over time you can see these effects, these category components and foil effects emerge over even just one experimental session. So it's quite interesting. Okay, so then just moving on to our last line of research. So I wanted to look at how people can be useful as something to learn from across the lifespan. So this is especially important when the prior knowledge that you have is not maybe as relevant, because let's say, there have been technological advances, you move to a new place or something where your prior knowledge is not as relevant and you need to gain more knowledge, and you kind of need to gain it quickly. Then people can be a shortcut for you. And so as infants and kids, we have people to teach us. Their jobs are to teach us, right? Like they get paid to teach us, in terms of like teachers. But you don't have that really as adults, especially older adults, after your last year of formal education. So learning from people as an adult, usually you're maybe learning from, as an older adult, you could be learning from grandchildren teaching you, maybe your adult children, or maybe from peers, but it's not a very, it's kind of this ad hoc process. It's not very structuralized like the way that that it is, earlier in the lifespan. So, and on top of that, so besides a little access to teachers, as adults, we're often very inside our comfort zone. So, we're learning, as researchers, even we're usually learning about stuff within our research area. But, it's very rare for you to hear about somebody, doing, learning to play the trumpet and then learning about physics when they're a psychologist or something like that. Partially because we don't have as much time, to learn about a bunch of new things. And then there could also be a very fixed mindset. So if you might think as an adult, oh, I've never been good at music or something, then I don't think I'm ever going to be good at it. So why try to learn something, related to that area? Whereas with kids, or even with babies, you wouldn't say, oh, I don't think they would be good at language, so we don't need to teach them, language. You teach them, and then you see how far they get, And as adults, there's also a very unforgiving environment, so it's very hard to make mistakes. The more mistakes you make, the more of a failure you might seem to be to yourself and also to other people. And there might be no serious commitment to learning, so you might be learning hobbies if it's not related to your job. And it's, they could be something that would be really easy to quit because it's not your main, focus. And then if you are learning something, it could be just one skill at a time. It's very difficult to be learning more than one skill at a time. Although, from infancy to childhood, you're learning a lot of things, all at the same time. Kids have 5 subjects in school and things like that here in the US. So, so there was a survey put out by AARP. So AARP is like a organization in the US for retired people. And so they did this survey of adults over 40 years of age, kind of like a representative sample in our in the US. And they found that 50% of the adults self-reported that they didn't learn new information on a weekly basis. And so I was alarmed by this, but I tried to dig through a little bit to see, like, well, maybe people are learning and they just don't realize that they're learning. But the other 50% who did say they were learning, included things like, Googling for information or reading the newspaper and stuff like that. So that means that the bar is actually quite low for somebody to say, I'm not doing any of that on a weekly basis. So if infants and children are in the situation where they have little access to teachers, people aren't encouraging them to learn stuff, they can't really make mistakes, they're not really exploring beyond their comfort zone and stuff like that, we actually call that deprivation in many ways. And so it's just interesting for me to see how on one end of the lifespan you have something so terrible that we try to fix as soon as possible. And then on the other end of the lifespan, the same things could be considered normal. So maybe that discrepancy is actually causing some partially, responsible for some of the decline that we see later in the lifespan. So just to drive home this point even more, when we talk about older adulthood, we often say stuff like cognitive maintenance, like maintaining your abilities and things like that. But during childhood, you would never say maintaining your ability because you would never, like, it's a last resort, right? So you would never hold the child back in school and not let them go to the next grade or the grade above if they were actually ready to do so. So so the idea of maintenance itself might actually be something that could help drive decline over time. And we also wanted to look at how learning multiple skills might actually help you figure out what to learn as well, because if you're learning multiple things at the same time, you might see diverse learning problems and examples and solutions, and identify similarities and differences among learning examples. You can also generalize, you could transfer, you can engage in creative problem solving, all of these things that are really critical for all learners across the lifespan, and something that people try to increase in older adulthood. But I feel like it's a kind of a byproduct of engaging in learning multiple skills. So we have this theory that if you are engaging in a lot of real world skill learning, then you're going to increase your cognitive abilities for learning. So there's some research supporting this. And then you're also going to be increasing your motivation to learn and adapt as well, because you'll see how useful it could be and things like that. And then the puzzle pieces that I showed you earlier on learning what to learn and how to learn, that actually is a really critical piece, because as you're learning your skills, you have a better sense of what to learn and how to learn as well, what may be relevant. And so all of these three things then feed into long-term functional independence in an environment that's constantly changing. So it's especially important now, especially with COVID. But even prior to COVID, we have our world is changing. I feel like faster than it was changing. Let's say even just a few decades ago. So older adults now have to be adapting more than maybe they had to before, but also they're living longer, so they by definition have to be, because the world is changing over a period of time. So if you conceptualize in terms of a car metaphor, then this cognitive abilities for learning would be kind of like the engine, and then motivation to learn would kind of be like the fuel, and then learning what to learn would kind of be like the GPS. So a lot of cognitive training studies, like brain training and stuff like that, they really focus just on the engine, but then maybe don't give them enough fuel or GPS to get to where they need to go. Or there might be motivation that try to improve motivation, increase motivation, but just give them a fuel without the engine and GPS, and then it's a lot harder to get to where you need to go. So we wanted to test this out, kind of as a first pass, to see if this has any kind of credibility in any way. And we also are very aware that the ideas here assume that there are adequate environmental resources. If everybody has everything they need to be able to learn, then this model would work. So I'll talk a little bit about environmental resources and disparities and things like that a little later. But this model assumes that. So in our first study, we wanted to see can older adults learn multiple skills at the same time? Would they, like, in terms of feasibility, will they just all quit? What will happen? And so we had 6 older adults come in to learn 3 skills at the same time. And so they learned painting, how to use an iPad, and kind of other tech related things, and Spanish. So then after the 6 people didn't quit for the whole 15 weeks, then we brought in 27 people to expand the study even further. So we in study 1, we had 6 people in the intervention group, and then we also had 9 people in a no contact control group. So they didn't do the intervention. We didn't contact them the whole 3 months. And then study 2 had 27 people in the intervention group and no contact group. And they learned Spanish, iPad, and painting in the first study. And then in the second study, they had drawing, Spanish, iPad, photography, music composition. Not everybody took all of these classes. They took at least 3 of them. And then we gave them the option of taking all 5 if they wanted to. But they had to be in the 3 that they were randomly enrolled in. So about 8 people took all 5, or 4 or 5 classes. So the first study was about 15 weeks and about 15 hours a week of classes and homework. And because the 15 weeks, they were a little long for the participants, because you really had to set aside your life. And by the 12-week mark, people were, starting to be, more absent in classes and things like that. And so based on feedback from the previous participants, then we changed study 2 to 12 weeks. So 3 months, and still about 15 hours a week of homework and things like that. So there was also this weekly discussion session on successful aging. So what kinds of barriers do you face when you're learning? What's your definition of successful aging, and talking about neuroplasticity and things like that. So debunking a lot of myths for them. So yeah, so that's that also happened weekly. And the way we selected the skills were based on novelty, difficulty, how real world they were, and social, right? So the social aspect of learning. So in terms of novelty, we wanted them to avoid any habits or routines they had to really maximize the amount of stuff that they could learn. And we wanted to increase their like learning, step by step. So, so that they wouldn't plateau too quickly. And it would be, we were trying to pick skills that would take years to master, like painting or learning a language, so that it's, not something you just master really quickly. And real world, so that they could transfer to other real world skills pretty much, as soon as they wanted to. And then they were also learning in a classroom environment, so it was very social. And this was important because they could see, a teacher that could teach them. They could also see other people struggling if they, so they wouldn't feel as bad if they were struggling themselves. They could share success stories. They could help each other. There could be accountability. People saying even just, "Where were you in class? I didn't see you in class," and things like that. So, so just to give you a sense of the paintings that people, had in the painting class. So this is a week 1 painting, not great, and you can tell these are novices. They, never really had any drawing or painting skills trained up. And then over time, they got a little better and a little better. And so this is someone's, week 13 painting, and, somebody else's. So they got really good over time. And so they were, surprised themselves with how good they got over time. So we first tested their cognitive abilities from before the intervention to after the intervention. So we have pre-test data from the first study, midpoint, and then post-test. And then we also have follow-up data that we're still analyzing. So I haven't included that here. And then in the second study, we had this baseline period where they came in a few weeks before the intervention started to get kind of like they were their own control group in a way. And there was no intervention activity between the baseline and pretest. So the kinds of cognitive measures we included were working memory and cognitive control. And just for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip over this, but this is part of a battery of standardized cognitive assessments. So like dot counting, NBAC, set shifting, and the flanker task. So these are the cognitive results from our study. So on the y-axis, you have the cognitive composite score. So from all 4 of those tasks combined, then you can get this cognitive composite score. And the blue line is the no contact control group. The green line is the first study, and the red line is the second study. And it's kind of hard to know like what these values mean, right? So you're like, okay, the red and the green kind of go up. What does going up actually mean? So this is an average older adult from a cross-sectional sample. If you just grab like, an older adult off the street in our area, this is kind of where they would land. And that's where the control group kind of hovered. And that's where the intervention groups started. This is where average younger adults are. So if you have 18 to 22-year-olds, that's kind of where they would be, undergraduates. And this is for middle-aged adults. So a group of, on average 42-year-olds. So this has an average age of 72. So this difference is a 30-year gap. So being able to bridge this distance is quite exciting, I think, because it's a 30-year gap. It's 30 years of decline, so to say. And so we were able to, largely bridge that within even just 6 weeks of an intervention that we did. So because of these data, then we were able to get some more money to try an intervention where, to really see what the dosage level is that you need. So in the prior study, everybody did, 6 hours a week of classes, and then, additionally on top of that, they had homework. and then 3 skills at a time. But really, maybe you just need 2 hours a week, but 3 skills. Like maybe the variability is really important. Or maybe it's just the number of hours, no matter how many skills you're learning. So 6 hours a week. Or maybe even any learning is, better than nothing. And that's where you can see improvements too. So we started running this in January, and then COVID hit, and we had to shut down the intervention in our whole lab and actually the whole university. So we were quite sad about that. And so we thought, okay, let's turn some lemons into lemonade and try to figure out how resilient are the older adults who were in our intervention than people who were not. So before we had to stop the intervention, we were in about week 8. Oh, we finished week 8. So they had 4 more weeks to go. But for 8 weeks, though, we were saying, you have to learn things, and this intervention is to help you learn things and to show you that learning is not that, it's challenging, but it's very doable and things like that. And, whenever the world changes, you're going to have to learn new stuff. And then, bam, COVID hits, and then they suddenly had to learn, they were telling us they had to learn how to do their own nails, or how to, fix their own toilets, or learn how to Zoom with their grandkids and things like that. So there were a lot of learning opportunities that they had to engage with after COVID. So we thought, let's try to document this and measure this. And so how, for the people who were in our intervention versus not in our intervention, older adults, what kinds of learning behaviors are they, engaging in, and what kinds of personal beliefs do they have about their ability to engage in these different behaviors? And then how socially connected are they because of these two things? And how might that lead to well-being, isolation, and loneliness over time? So we have older adults who were in our intervention versus not, and then also middle-aged adults and younger adults who were not in our intervention, but maybe the older adults in our intervention might look maybe closer to middle-aged adults who were not in the intervention, or something like that. So it's also important to kind of do these kinds of comparisons. And we're also looking at disparities in terms of resources available and health disparities and things like that, because about 1/3 of our sample are people from ethnic racial minorities and maybe low income and things like that. So it would be really good to see. Maybe there are also resilience trajectories, right? So although there could be disparities, there could be resilience trajectories among these different groups. So that's something we're working on now before we can start the intervention again. And also before everything shut down, we collected some blood samples from the intervention participants as well. So in terms of behavioral measures, only 3 cognitive interventions with older adults so far have included more than 25% of participants from at-risk groups of at risk for cognitive decline, racial and ethnic minorities, and low income. And so 20 to 30% of our participants from our intervention are in this wave. And so maybe we might see different behavioral effects from including a more diverse group. And so in terms of blood data, so we have blood biomarkers. We're looking at stress from learning. So maybe the whole intervention is actually quite stressful for older adults, if you can imagine. And so maybe that might lead to increased inflammatory markers that may interfere with neural growth factor signaling. However, if you've dealt with stress a lot in your life, maybe the intervention is not as stressful as other things going on in your life. So it's unclear right now. And also we want to look at AD-related dysregulation of biological pathways. So because there might be exaggerated inflammatory responses in AD. So just to sum up, we want to see how learning actually is an important privilege. And so that's the hypothesis and or the theory. And so what we're arguing is that learning is, if you're learning relevant information, and as the caveat, personally relevant information. So if something is relevant to me, it may not be relevant to you to learn, right? But learning personally relevant information is really important because it helps you maintain functional independence as the world changes over time. And then it's also a privilege because you really need a lot of time and effort, growth mindset, resources, the more difficult the skills are to learn. And as you fall behind, then you will need even more resources to kind of catch up. And so my goal for the next, couple decades at least, is to try to increase access to learning opportunities across the lifespan, and to know who they will benefit the most, and how we can do so, most effectively. So I just want to thank the main collaborators on these projects, and all of the RAs and the funding agencies. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this amazing talk. It's very, very interesting, the thing that you've been talking about. So I invite all the viewers, they can write their questions in the chat, also in YouTube and Facebook. And I would like to ask you, in the meantime, because of the delay that we have in the transmission, about 30 seconds, I would like to ask you about these three main analogies that you have here as the fuel, the engine, and the GPS. I'm thinking, and I always ask this question in this pandemic, in this crisis of the COVID-19. In the second one, the motivation thing, because I know that there's some distractors, and also a lot of maybe discouraged about the online teaching, with the not only with the adults, also in the young, and they are not, they don't find the motivation to follow this learning through this online system. So what can you tell us about that in
So
this
what I've been
analogy?
telling my students is that the more you have the long-term goal in mind, the better, right? And I also say this to participants too, the older adult participants. So the long-term goal for older adults is to maintain their ability to stay independent, right? To not live in a nursing home and things like that. So if that's your goal, keep that in mind, because then, everything you do will help you get to that goal, right? So for young adults, if their goal is to have a good career, a happy life, a career that they actually like, then a lot of preparation needs to go into that, right? Part of that could be day to day, when you're doing well in your classes, you have a good GPA, you learn the right material so that you can then get the job that you want and stuff like that. So it could seem hard if you're in terms of motivation, if you're just focusing on the short term. But if you're focusing on the long term, and you can really, really see how it will help you in the long run, then you might maybe gain a little bit of motivation that way. So at least that's what helps me, right? To see what is the long-term goal here? Like what are we trying to do? I can see how it's difficult to maintain motivation, on a day-to-day basis. But the more you can keep track of or keep in mind the long-term goals, I think that hopefully will help the most.
And following that line, also in the analogy, now at the GPS level, how do you balance this? For example, in this pandemic, you have several more opportunities to learn, or more environment learning that we have even before. In fact, for example, this talk that we are having, it was not something traditional in before the COVID-19. How do you get a balance of having several opportunities for learning in order to use correctly your GPS or your ability to learn what to learn?
It kind of depends on what else you need to do in your life, right? So babies and kids don't have to pay a mortgage, don't have to, their only job, for the most part, is to learn and develop, right? So they have a lot of flexibility in exploring a lot of new stuff and everything like that. And if you're in a job that allows you to explore 50% of the time, and then pays you for 50% of your your time to do something productive, then you have that much time, right? Like so you have a little less time than babies and kids, but still more time than a typical person working 40 hours a week or something, and can't explore very much. So so it I think in some ways, basically, it just means like the society might dictate for you, and you might not have the luxury of being able to explore and do all these things. However, the pandemic has made it quite a bit easier and easier and faster and cheaper to be able to learn new stuff. So if there is a way to take, advantage of it, like, if you've always wanted, let's say piano lessons, and you couldn't get to somebody, you didn't have time to like drive somewhere, or you didn't have, enough money or something. Now you might have, free piano lessons over, online or something, right? That like those kinds of opportunities are nice. And so they're open for people who have the flexibility in their day-to-day, jobs to be able to take advantage of. So, yeah.
Perfect. Shaser says that your work is very interesting and your page is very cool. So she says hi from Mexico also. I would like to ask you if you are trying to move also your research about, I don't know, measuring in a fMRI data, or you are going to continue with the EEG.
For
what is
the
your
older
plan
adults?
in that sense?
Yeah. So we did actually scan some
Yes.
older adults, but we're still looking at the data. It's there. The intervention created a lot of data. So we're interested in, continuing both the blood biomarker research, the MRI stuff, the EEG stuff. So basically what we're trying to do is have a very rich idea of what happens to the older adults in the intervention, both the good and the bad, because once we know that, then we have a better idea of who this intervention can best help, and how can we help people where it's not really helping them, what can we do to change the intervention to help them.
And what do you think that could be, I don't know, maybe a motivation or something good? Here in Mexico, we have, now with the pandemic, we have a new set of program in television that are dedicated for classes using the television. One of the reasons is that most people don't have access to internet or a computer, so they have a television at home. So they are broadcasting TV shows in the educational program from the Ministry of Education. So many grandparents and fathers and mothers are helping and joining their childs during the sessions. I don't know if you think that could be also a good thing for the adults in order to get, I don't know, remember all the old stuff and maybe to learn a new
Yeah,
things.
especially,
What do you
at
think about
the
that?
high school or college level. Probably I would say like, elementary is a little bit maybe too basic for the older adults. But it would help, the child to have, some kind of caregiver with them, right? So that benefit is, probably always going to be there. But if it's, difficult content that, like if I had to learn stuff from high school again, I probably, that I would probably find it challenging because I forgot a lot of it, but yeah, definitely for like college level material. So I always encourage people to try out the, free online courses, from Coursera or Khan Academy or something like that, because it's the same idea, so to challenge, like, if you feel like as an older adult that, what you're watching is not that challenging, then, like if you could have learned that on your own or something, like it's then that's not the right level. You want to find whatever's most challenging for you, within reason. So for some older adults, maybe something at a middle school level or something would be appropriately challenging. But for other older adults, maybe something at the college level, a PhD level, a graduate level would be more challenging for them. So, yeah.
Excellent. If there's another question, you can put it on the chat. And I would like to ask you, we have here, well, the university have now a program since the last year. They launched a university for the adults. So they have this new program that is very, very exciting and very motivating for the adults. And they also have a YouTube channel that I recommend to our viewers to follow. But what could be your, I don't know, your recommendation from your research to put more emphasis on?
I get the sense that older adults like to learn things that they find are useful. So it's there might be, issues in terms of enrollment if people might think, things are not that useful. Why should I be doing this, right? And those are the people that actually would probably need, would benefit most from, these kinds of programs. Although it seems like everybody probably would benefit in some way. So one thing you can do in terms of messaging is to not feed into stereotypes about, that, oh, you're just, just do as little as you need to, or, like those kinds of negative stereotypes. But to really indicate why they're learning, all of these things, right? And so sometimes you can just learn for fun, because learning is can be inherently a fun activity. But there's a deeper thing that I think really is important, which is that you're learning to stay independent, because at some point you're going to encounter a situation where you think, I can either learn this and stay independent, or I can not learn this and depend on somebody else to do it for me, and so after years and decades of thinking, well, I'll just depend on somebody for that, then you become, dependent, as your characteristic, right? So I think it's important to remind older adults that this is why they're doing it, this is one of the main reasons, besides it just being a fun, activity. But yeah, so I think sprinkling in skills that people think would be relevant, such as any skills with technology or something like that, plus any other topics that would be, fun to learn too, any creative arts and, things like that. But focusing on things that would be difficult to learn, and not so easy that because some adult classes I've seen are they kind of underestimate what older adults can do, and so it's disappointing sometimes for me to see why would you create a curriculum for older adults when you don't expect them to, learn beyond lesson 2 or something of Spanish classes, right? So they might have classes where for 6 weeks they go over nouns or something, right? And it's that's not the level of what people in college or high school learn. They they learn a lot faster and they learn a lot more. So so to challenge both the instructors and the learners, the students, right, to really see what their potential is, and not place a ceiling, right, to say, oh, you're only going to be as good at that, so we're just going to structure the curriculum this way so that it's easier for you, so just start off with the college level, why not? And then if they get better than that, then go beyond that, right? And if they need to adjust it, then you can adjust it in whatever direction. So
Perfect. So Chaser says, thank you for sharing your time and knowledge. It was very special to listen to you. And I would like to close. We are about to the end of our talk. Thank you very much, Rachel, for that. And I would like to ask you, because as I said at the beginning of the talk, I admire you. Your career is very, very amazing. So I think it's very, very cool what the things that you are doing. I think it's very important, relevant for the society. And also I would like to ask you for a message for the students that they are listening to us, that most of them are interested in working with children and the young adults, but I think that it's very important to work, as you said, with the elder ones. So what is your message for them, for these students that they are interested in doing some research about learning on all the lifespan, as you mentioned?
Yeah, so my training is actually with babies, because I was like, oh, I want to help babies, right? But it turns out most babies turn out okay. Really, the people who need help for us in society now are older adults. There aren't as many people helping, I think, as we need. And when you learn more about older adults, you get a general sense of how development happens across the lifespan, what babies turn into later, so we learn a lot more about infants and children as well by learning about adults. So you to develop that lifespan perspective, I think, is really important. And just the number of older adults, so right now, I think in less than 10 years or something, there will be more people over 65 than under 18. That's got to tell you something, right, in terms of where we should be concentrating our resources. So and it doesn't mean you have to do only one thing at a time, right? Like, I'm doing the whole lifespan at the same time. So, you don't have to choose, but at least focus some time and effort, I think, on helping older adults. I think that's so critical right now. Some countries are already in a situation where they have so many older adults that, there aren't enough younger adults to kind of, support, let's say, like Social Security or, kind of retirement benefits and things like that. So, yeah.
Perfect. So I want to give you a final question that arrived. Do you think, Roberto asking, do you think the learning process will be quite different in adults who learn to avoid disability and adults who learn for curiosity?
At the basic level, I don't think the mechanisms are different. The brain is still the brain, right? I think in terms of motivation, right? So you might have pieces missing that you have to, or pieces that are like that have to be kind of built up. But the overall structure, I think, is probably pretty similar. So yeah, so you might have to build up some motivation then before before they start learning. But once they start learning, then it's it'll probably be follow the same structure. That's my guess. But the field is open, and I invite everybody to come and join this research with older adults. So.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rachel. I think I appreciate again this opportunity. I think it was an amazing talk. Thank you very much. I think it's a very, very important topic nowadays. In fact, more with the pandemic, that we are living in a kind of situation with the psychological things like depression, anxiety, stress of being in the confinement. So thank you very much, Rachel. I hope you have a good time with us.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great. Thank you for having me. This was excellent.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I would like to continue in touch with you. And so it's established some collaboration that we have here. As I mentioned before, we have this project for the adults. So thank you very much. And we stay for a little longer. We are about to close the transmission, but I would like to invite you to the following talks that we have. We have a recess. We have a recess in this 1 month and a half, but we are returning in December with Rebecca Merkley, Cognitive Foundation on Early Years Math Development, Insights from Research Practice Partnership on December 9th. And also we have a talk from Clotilde Gonzalez from Carnegie Mellon, from the boundaries of instant-based learning theory for explaining decisions for experience on December 17th. So we have a lot of activities following, also the outreach seminar and more ideas that we have in there. So thank you very much for being here. Be safe, and thank you very much again. So I'm going to close the transmission. I stay with Rachel for a couple of minutes, and thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.